For example, I will fish a 4-weight rod with a 2-weight line for dry flies.
Hey everyone, this is John Kolb and Dave Ruthrock with The Ranting Angler. This video is part of our series on fly fishing gear, and today we're going to be covering fly fishing lines. So Dave, buying a fly line should be easy. I just got a 9-foot 5-weight fly rod, and I'm going to buy a 6-weight line like everybody says. Is that true? And what consideration should I take when buying a fly line?
A lot of people will tell you today, because of the fact that so many of these rods are faster actions, that you should purchase a line that's 1 line weight heavier than what the rod is marked for. I'm not of that persuasion. I believe if it's a 9-foot 5-weight, then you get a 5-weight line. It's because today what line manufacturers are doing is actually designing lines that, and let's get some point of reference here. A 5-weight line is supposed to weigh, according to the standards that were set years ago, 140 grains plus or minus 6 grains in the first 30 feet of that fly line. Now, if the 140 grains is the number that we're going to be looking at for a 5-weight, when you look on a box that the line comes in and it says it weighs 150 grains, and yes, 146 would still be acceptable as a 5-weight, but now we're above that. Is it truly a 5-weight? Well, that's a good question. The manufacturer says it is. Well, what happens if you buy a 5-weight line and you look on the box and it says it weighs 160 grains? That's actually a 6-weight. So is it still a 5-weight? Then too, and I'm not going to answer that question yet, then too, you look at some of these lines and you say, okay, I bought a weight forward line, which is typically the most popular line that's in use today when it comes to floating fly lines. So we have front tapers that can run anywhere from 5 feet up to 10 feet or even longer. Now, these lines will still weigh whatever it takes in grains in that first 30 feet to meet what should be described as a 5-weight line. But they'll cast a little bit differently. Is this something that would really concern someone when they go in and buy a 5-weight fly line? The best way I can answer that is probably not. Because you see, no matter what the fly line profile or grain weight is, as long as the manufacturer marks it for a 5-weight, it's going to cast okay on that rod.
So one of the things you had mentioned was a taper. What is a taper, and what things should I look at when picking a fly line regarding the taper?
Tapered lines are a line that will start out thin at the tip and then gradually increase in diameter. And most of the lines that I've actually taken a micrometer to, you're going to see about a 10,000ths difference. Then you're going to go from that taper into the thickest part of that line, which is called the belly. And then you may actually see a fairly significant rear taper, which on a weight forward line goes down to what we call the running line, which is by far the thinnest line on that entire fly line. When you talk about taper, for presentation, more delicate presentations, we look at obviously a longer taper. That keeps the weight back from the end of the fly line. Now, for other applications, you may want a shorter front taper. And in reality, I'm going to say that tapers of anywhere from about 7 to 10 feet would be a little bit more delicate in their presentation. Once you get down to 5 and 6 feet, then I'm saying that that line is becoming what I call front loaded. You have more weight up front. Now, when you're fishing your average run-of-the-mill dry flies, and you're fishing, let's say, a 10-foot front taper, we get really good turnover and good presentation with obviously less disturbance closer to the end of the fly line. We get a little bit more disturbance, obviously, the shorter that taper becomes. But the other thing it does is once we get into the shorter tapers, it also allows us to turn over and present bushier, more wind-resistant flies, or in the case of fishing a strike indicator when you're nymphing. That more front-loaded line will help you in delivering that extra weight as well. So there are some benefits to looking at a little bit different in taper with regard to the application.
And I started the video mentioning buying a 6-weight fly line to match my 5-weight fly rod, because whenever I do research on the internet, that's what everybody recommends. But you've already alluded to some of these fly line manufacturers are already overweighting their lines. So if I bought that 6-weight fly line that's already on the heavy side, I might end up be pairing my 7-weight line to a 5-weight rod, and then it's going to cast clunky and have issues with the line turning over. So one thing, when you and I were fishing together, I tried your fly line and your fly rod, and I noticed you do something very unusual than other fly anglers by underweighting your line. So can you explain why you do that and the benefit of underweighting versus overweighting?
Yeah, I'm a little odd in that regard. And by the way, there's another very, very, very well-known fly fisher that also recommends giving it a try to putting a line on your rod that's anywhere from 1 to 2 weights lower than what the rod is recommended for. I do that because I can get away with it. Now, that's a crazy statement to make, but in reality, yes, there is a reason I do it. For example, I will fish a 4-weight rod with a 2-weight line for dry flies because I want that additional delicacy and presentation that the 2-weight line affords me. But by the same token, when I go to set the hook, I have the response because of the fact that I have a 4-weight rod. And I believe seriously that I get a little bit more quick strike response so that hook will penetrate fish flesh just a microsecond more quickly. And maybe, just maybe, I won't miss quite as many fish. It's surprising that when I'm guiding, for example, I'll talk to someone or I'll talk to one of my casting instructor friends about that. And they kind of scratch their heads and say, yeah, that's not going to work very well at all, until I hand them my system and say, please, try it. They're really, really surprised at the performance that they can obtain out of what I put together to fish like that. What's interesting, too, is I have other leaders and lines set up, again, 2 weights a lot of the time, that are going to be used for different applications. I have another 2-weight system that I have set up for fishing indicators. I'm still fishing it on a 3 or a 4-weight rod, and I still get very, very satisfactory performance even when I want to switch over and fish a dry fly, which I can do very quickly. So with that versatility and still being able to see all of the benefits of that lighter line, that's definitely something I'm going to include in my equipment inventory.
So we talked about general fly fishing lines. Are there any specialty lines that we should consider when fly fishing?
Oh, there are a number of lines that you can consider beyond just the average run-of-the-mill going in and saying, I want a 5-weight weight-forward line. We have to keep in mind that there are a lot of specialty lines that are being manufactured today. And that's some of, I believe, the reason that we see some confusion with regard to fly lines. You have lines that are designed strictly for streamer fishing. You have lines that are designed strictly to deliver bass bugs. And then too, you got to keep in mind that beyond the floating lines, you have sink tip lines and sinking lines. But not only do you have sink tip lines and sinking lines, you have those lines that are actually designed to sink at different rates. So you'd be amazed at what's out there. Go into a fly shop and look at the variety of fly lines that they have on the shelves. And yeah, it's easy to boggle one's mind. There's no question about that. But when you consider perhaps expanding beyond just getting that floating fly line, then too, you can think about if you're going to specialize in this Euro nymphing, then you might want to think about going with a 22 thousandths, or one manufacturer actually makes a 17 thousandths diameter fly line. It's level. There's no taper to it whatsoever. So it's exactly the same diameter from tip to tip. And those are marketed for Euro nymphing. Some people still like the feel of a fly line. I'm one of them. Now, I'll be honest with you, those lines don't cast a dry fly very well. And I've had people tell me otherwise, but when I try it, it doesn't work too well. And I would very, very much doubt that when placed in the hands of John or Jane Q fly fisher, they would really perform adequately. So that being the case, if you're going to go ahead and purchase one of those Euro nymphing lines, you might want to reconsider if you're going to fish anything other than that style of nymph fishing. You got to keep in mind too, they're not going to cast a dry fly very well. So that's something to keep first and foremost in your mind.
So I notice when I buy a fly line, I'm not just buying a fly line, there's something else that I'm putting on the reel. Can you explain what that is and considerations for that item?
We're talking about backing. And you'll see, as we mentioned earlier, that when you buy a fly reel, it's going to tell you how much backing and fly line capacity that reel has. Backing, some people would say, is just something on there to take up space. Now, backing is usually Dacron, or it can be monofilament, depending. I would not recommend monofilament because of the fact monofilament does have memory, and that can be a problem if you ever get down into your backing. By the way, most people will never see the back end of their fly line. I have, and I consider backing important. Do I need 50 to 100 yards of backing on my reel, depending on what the capacity of that reel is? No, I don't need it, but it does enable me to consider the fact that then I don't have my fly line wrapped on such a narrow arbor as I might if I don't have all of that backing on there. So that's one of the things to consider. What's nice is the fact that once you get into the backing, especially if I've got Dacron, and by the way, most lines will take 20-pound test backing overall. Now, when you get into your heavier fly lines, you're probably going to go up into that 30-pound test backing. And then too, when I go down into my lighter fly lines, especially the twos and the threes, then I'm going to be usually looking at 12-pound backing. Now, what's interesting is we talk about pound test with backing. Most people don't realize that fly lines aren't very strong with regard to their strength. In fact, I'm not going to say that we might even see 25 and 30-pound test in a lot of our fly lines. That's not necessarily the case. We don't need that kind of strength in our fly lines. And so that being the case, it's all about capacity. It's all about the size of the fly line and what's going to actually be on that reel and the function that it's going to present or provide the angler.
So when buying a fly line, also we need to discuss the loop at the end of the fly line, the welded loop, and your thoughts on if that's necessary or should be avoided.
Okay. I'll be honest with you. I can't stand welded loops. Now, I do keep them on some of my fly lines. They used to be very weak in the past. They're a little bit stronger now, but to me it's still a really high risk factor. Imagine hooking and playing the fish of a lifetime, and you have a welded loop on a 3-weight line, and all of a sudden that loop breaks and you lose the fish of a lifetime. Are we going to remain happy for the rest of the day? Obviously not. I say get rid of the loops. Go ahead and tie on a nail knot or some other knot that you might really like to bring that line to leader connection into what it needs to be. But you got to keep in mind too, and especially it holds true if you ever take a fly line out and cast it without a leader, there's a lot of kick because of that extra weight of that loop. You've got double the fly line in that loop. It's a line that's doubled back on itself. And so that's double the weight. Even though it's a very short length of line, it's still double the weight. And I don't want double the weight up at the end of my fly line. So let's think about what we have here with regard to the guides on our rod. We have snake guides. the loop-to-loop connections will go through them fairly easily, but not nearly as easily as I would like. Where we really run into problems is with single foot guides. Now we have a guide that runs perpendicular to the direction that the line's going to go. And I will tell you, those loops will hang up time and time and time again. And it's just a frustrating experience to have to deal with that. I don't want to have to deal with it, so chop the loop off. It's not going to do anything but increase the performance of that fly line.
So I have my backing, my fly line, I'm ready to go fishing. I fished for a few outings. What do I need to take into consideration for care and maintenance of my fly line?
I chuckle only because I don't do what you should. Really, the best thing that you can do is clean a fly line after every outing. Most people don't realize, I think this still holds true, what the typical life of a fly line is. I think it still holds to be about 200 hours of fishing. And obviously, a fly line is going to be exposed to all sorts of things, not only the elements, but also to grit and dirt and scraping over rocks, and every once in a great while, maybe even being stepped on. And I've ruined a few fly lines that way. So that's one thing to try to avoid. Cortland makes these patches to clean fly lines. They're very, very easy to use. They're not expensive. You run a patch over your fly line every few times that you're out, preferably every time you're out on the water when you get back, and you're going to increase the length of that fly line to the point that it should last the length of time that it's actually designed to last.
It should cast better too, right? A clean line over.
Yes, yeah. For someone that distance casts every once in a while, a clean line will actually give me up to 10 feet more distance. Clean versus dirty. And a fly line can dirty up real fast.
So that does it for fly lines. Make sure that you check out the rod video in the reel video and be subscribed for future videos from the Ranting Angler.